He's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience.
And he's Howard Eibach, a former creative director and copywriter and the author of 2 books on the creative brief with a lot of experience. Look at the gray in that beard. And together we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. So, Howard, we're back for another episode of the Brief Brothers. And, you mentioned a topic to me that I think is an interesting one, and you're coming at it from the former creative side, right? Which is there's certain questions you think that a creative should ask of the brief writer, of the strategist, of the account person who writes the brief, whoever that person responsible for the brief is, who they should ask when they first see the draft of the brief. And we're talking kind of in general, the brief writer will write a draft and then share it with a top creative or a couple of the creatives from the creative team to kind of get a pre-approval before sharing it with a wider creative team. And you kind of have a checklist of questions that maybe a creative could ask the strategist at that point in time. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, Henry, I thought about this a while. I think it's a great insight into this relationship between the creatives and the person writing the brief, or it might be a small group of people. And we've had the discussion many times before about planners and strategists like you are responsible for writing the brief yourself, whereas in a client situation, and I encounter that a lot in my training, there isn't necessarily a strategist, or a strategist has many other duties and shares the responsibility of writing a brief. So I thought, what would be some of the things that a creative could ask? And I've come up with a list of about 6 things. The first question, and quite frankly, I'm not sure that I have this in any particular order, but the first question is, I've got the brief in front of me, I've got a draft of the brief, and depending upon how the structure of the brief lays out, and we've both seen many different versions of briefs, and some ask direct questions and some don't. So if the question is, if the single-minded proposition is prominent on the brief, well, the first question that I would like to ask is, well, what is the emotion that you want me to appeal to? Does the single-minded proposition really explicitly identify that emotion, or do I have to work at it, to guess at it? Now, so for example, we've talked before about a brief that I love, which was a British brief for the BBC's coverage of the Olympics in 2012. And the single-minded proposition for that brief was, the Olympics is made of heroes. So there's not a clear emotion in that statement, but I can draw the conclusion that we're talking about pride. Pride is what I think about when I think of a hero. So I might ask the brief writer, were you going at pride when you were talking about heroes? Because it's a British agency working for a British broadcaster covering an Olympics that's being hosted in the United Kingdom. So we're talking about an audience which is exclusively or mostly British, Irish, Scottish citizens. So are we talking about pride? That would, to me, would foster a discussion, and either I'd be on board or I'd be off board. Another brief that I've encountered was for a Kiwi brief written by an American agency here called the Richards Group. And their single-minded proposition was, for Kiwi shoe polish, was, though you might not be looking down, others are. The brief was written for specifically men who cared about how they look. But clearly, it's about men who look good from the ankles up, but somehow forget about polishing their shoes. So the emotion that I'm appealing to is going to be, well, is it fear? Is it embarrassment? I'd want to have that conversation with the creative brief writer to make sure that we're synced, because the last thing I want is to, be off in left field.
Well, that makes a ton of sense. One would hope, right? And I think that the examples that you gave are probably good ones in the sense of looking at the brief in its totality. You have a pretty good idea of what the answer to that question is. But I think it's always a good check off, because especially if the brief writer isn't because you're showing examples of what you consider to be good briefs, really good briefs, right?
Yes.
So if the brief isn't as good, or the brief writer isn't as experienced, and you mentioned sometimes, it's done by a committee or whatever, it might not be as polished or single-minded. And so some of these things might be more vague. And so kind of trying to corner them on some of these things certainly is I think a valid question that a creative should ask.
And I think that's the basis of all these questions. It's just to make sure that I'm thinking the same way that you're thinking. Let's just clarify. The last thing you want to do is assume. So my next question is, okay, I've seen your brief and you've told me if the question isn't asked, why are we advertising or what's the problem we're trying to solve? I'm going to ask the question, what really is the problem that we're trying to solve on behalf of the customer? What problem does she face? And how is our product truly going to solve this problem for him or for her?
I think that's a great point, because so many briefs are written from the client's perspective, right? The advertiser's perspective and their problem. And, a really important part of that is the consumer's problem, not
Right.
the problem.
That's a question that I ask when I'm teaching people how to write a brief. Are we solving the business problem, or are we trying to solve a human problem? It should be a human problem, which is for the customer. Okay, my next question is, so once the briefing begins, what is your plan? And now this relates both to pre-COVID and our world now virtual, and we're all hoping that, of course, this is going to loosen up a bit and we can go back into the real world. But when you've written your brief and you're going to prepare to brief it, what are you going to do to bring this creative brief to life? Are you going to take us to a store, a restaurant, to the factory floor, to the showroom? What are you going to do to get me, the creative, out of this office environment so that I can try to live and breathe and see what my customer who's going to use this product or service is going to do? So get me out of my office if you can.
So
if it's a virtual experience, what can you bring to the Zoom meeting that at least makes an attempt to put that product in context?
Yeah, and in an ideal world, the brief writer would have pre-thought that out, and will have gained a reputation for being creative in that sense of how to bring it to life and make it fun. Because I get a sensation that a lot of us, sometimes we're not having fun anymore, and this should be fun. Like, it's like you get to try your client's product on as if you were a consumer, right? Or live that experience. So, if the strategist isn't thinking about that, certainly the creatives could suggest that to the strategist or the brief writer to do those kinds of things. I think they're invaluable. I think I've given an example before. I taught a class called Heroes and Sidekicks at the Miami Ad School, and I wrote a brief, and they were supposed to develop creative for it, and I had to send the brief via email, so I wasn't able to do the briefing. But the brief was for Advanced Auto Parts, a big auto parts store, national, and I Google searched how far the stores were from the Miami Ad School. There were 2 stores within 2 miles, right? And then when they presented me the creative, I asked each team, I said, did you go to the stores to visit them? Only 1 team out of 20 actually went to the stores. And that was something that they had an opportunity to experience themselves and say, let me try this. Let me go find out about this. It's really hard to develop things from your desk. Again, I talk about putting on the costume of the target audience, doing that and kind of having that experience.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay, so the next question is, and I don't have my Post-it notes around the computer, so I've got notes in front of me. Said, how did you arrive? I mean, I'm going to see your description of who the customer is. You're going to have a question on the brief that says, who are we talking to? Describe the customer. So I'm going to ask, having read this, how did you arrive at the final description of your customer? You couldn't include everything that you knew. Did you have a debate internally in your head about what I should include and what I should toss? How did you make that decision? And then even more importantly, imagine the customer reading this brief, and a customer isn't going to really know how to deal with the brief because that's not his or her world. But just imagine a customer reading that. Would they see themselves in this brief? So that's, I think, a great series of questions to ask, just to clarify the brief writer knows who we're talking to.
I think what we're getting at is, skills that a brief writer needs to have, right? Like, I mean, being able to weed out the stuff that was said in focus groups that wasn't important, identifying the stuff that you heard again and again in the groups that was important and that was surprising, or somehow enlightening, to the problem. I think that as a brief writer, you start establishing a reputation as either a good one or a bad one. And if you're a good one, they're going to be more accepting of your target description or accepting of your brief overall, because they know that you did the homework. And when they ask you these types of questions, you have the right answers. You didn't say, well, I just pulled this out of my ass. No, I went to sat in focus groups. I looked at the data. Here you go. I didn't want to bore you with all this stuff, but here it is. You can kind of communicate how well versed you are in the target audience.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. My next question is, if the insight, and again, this depends upon how the brief is structured. Some briefs actually have a question that says, what is the insight? Most of the best briefs I've read don't ask that question directly. The insights are woven into all of the answers on the brief. So if it's the case where there's no direct question, my question would be, is my understanding of the insight the same as your belief in the insight? Let me tell you what I think the insight is based on this brief, and are we aligned? Because, like I said, the best briefs don't always come right out and say, here is the insight. So I don't want to make an assumption and get it wrong. I'm going to ask you, this is what I think the insight is based on your one-page brief, and knowing you the way I do, you write a really tight brief, but I want to make sure we're aligned.
I think that's a great point. I think that the word insight is probably the most overused in advertising and the least understood.
Yep.
And everybody has a different definition for it, and that's a problem. So I think that questioning whether the insight is written or not, questioning it is certainly something that a creative should be doing. Episode idea, we should do an episode just on an insight. Like, what is an insight? What makes a good insight? Because I think that you and I could probably talk for 20 minutes easily on what's a good insight, what is it, and how to get to one. So certainly aligning on whether it's a powerful insight or not, or if it's not articulated as such in the brief, saying, I get the feeling the insight here is X, and making sure that both the strategist and the creative director are on the same page with that, for sure.
And then my last question is, it may sound obvious, but it's just one of those gut checks that I would ask, and that is, I know this is a draft. It might be close to a final draft. How comfortable, how happy are you with this brief, and what can I do to help you make it a better brief?
Another really good question, because everybody has insecurities, right? And you try to put your best foot forward, and do your best effort, but sometimes you don't have time, or you're not solving the problem to your own standard. You don't think that you've got the nut cracked, right? So I think kind of how confident are you in this brief is a good question, because if the strategist isn't confident, it's not to declare defeat, but you said, in the spirit of, let's talk about it and maybe be a sounding board. And I think that it is important that a strategist has other people to kind of give input. So that's where there is a benefit, in terms of having another strategist who isn't maybe working on the assignment look at the brief, right? Sure. Having a direct report look at the brief, or having a superior look at the brief if they're available. Having somebody on the account team who is particularly strategic and smart, and whose opinion, having the conversation, say, I'm having a problem with this brief, I think is good. But the creatives certainly are also capable of it. And, let's give creatives their due. I've met some creatives that are very strategic in their thinking, right? I know creators that could have been strategists because they know the business, they know consumer mindset, they know client mindset. They could have been in that field. And some creators are just not prepared to have those kind of conversations. They're in their artsy world, or their world of words, and that's not to take away from their talent. But just knowing that different people have different strengths and weaknesses. But certainly some creatives could certainly help you solve a brief, for sure.
Right. Well, I think the point to take here is, this is a team effort. This is a collaborative effort. And you know, we've had discussions about good collaboration and not so good collaboration. But here the point is, whether you're in an agency or you're in the client, you shouldn't do anything by yourself, because you're weakening your own position if you don't get others' input. When I was a working creative, I always had an art director to lean on. And the art director was my BS detector. We always need BS detectors, right?
Yep. And you know, there are elements where you're working as a lone wolf, but you should always be bringing people in to the thought process, because they especially once you've evaluated the people around you and know who's likely to give you help and be able to do it. Because at the end, you do need buy-in. The good creative brief isn't good unless the people who consume the brief are buying in.
Right. That's the one part of a creative brief that's not even written into it. It's called trust.
Yep. Good stuff, Howard.
Good stuff, Henry. Thanks so much.
So, Howard, we're back for another creative review, and today we're looking at a new piece of creative from Domino's Pizza. The agency is Crispin, Porter, and Boguski, an agency I'm very familiar with, formerly of Miami, now of Boulder, Colorado. Let's take a look at it.
At Domino's, we're constantly innovating to find better ways to deliver you pizza, which is why we're testing driverless delivery powered by Neuro, and it's got someone back to their old habits. Avoid the Noid when you get any 2 or more medium 2-topping Domino's pizzas delivered for just $5.99 each.
Okay, Howard, so what do you think about this new creative from Domino's?
Well, I'll tell you, Henry, I don't like it. And I don't like it for 3 reasons. Again, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of I'm a creative director. The team has come to me and showed me this concept. And I see a TV spot with 3 messages. The first message is, we're going to be innovative with this new technology to deliver the pizza. The second message is, we're bringing back a character that's 40 years old, which means you got to be at least in your mid-50s to have any recollection. And the third message is, oh, by the way, there's some pizza involved. That's a classic violation of anyone who works in advertising's understanding of what it is that we do to sell a brand. They're not even selling them. The innovation has nothing to do with the pizza. It's about delivering the pizza. So 3 messages, none of which really sell the pizza. Bringing back a 40-year-old cartoon character, which is going to be questionable at best, and who might remember it. Big thumbs down. I think they bombed here. But, you know, I'm holding back.
Tell us how you really feel.
Exactly.
So I didn't think this was a particularly good piece of creative either. I think, number one, the reason that the creative even exists to me is dubious, right? Like, this is a thing that they're testing, and they're making a commercial about something that they're testing. It's kind of cool, right? Like, it's something that's in the time that we live in, like driverless cars and all that. Like, you know, it's very futuristic or what, but it is a test, right? So like, there might be one of those cars in one city in the country, right? Like, that's a test. So in that sense, there's really no news here. The other part with annoyed, I'm not as annoyed by as you are. I think, you know, I'm a big believer in distinctive assets and brand assets. And I think that at one time, the Noid was a distinctive asset for Domino's. And for those who are watching and are not in their 50s like I am, that don't know what this little cartoon character they just saw is, the Noid was a fictional creature that Domino's created once upon a time in an ad campaign to describe all of the little things that conspire to make your pizza bad, right? Like the cheese sticking to the top of the box, it gets there too cold, it ruins your pizza, your delivery pizza, basically. And in that sense, it's a pretty genius character. The problem is that they abandoned it a long time ago, and I don't think they're doing a great job of reintroducing it. If you're going to reintroduce a character like this, then reintroduce him properly. Like say, hey, this is the Noid. And they kind of like just, well, look who's up to his old tricks again, the Noid. And it just felt like a big disconnect. It's like, would the Noid be more interested in disrupting the automated delivery than a regular delivery? Like, there's just a lot. It's very convoluted.
Well, I think of a 16-year-old who's seeing this for the first time that says, who's up to his old tricks again? And the kid says, huh? He has no idea, or she has no idea who this Noid was.
Yeah.
You're right. If you're going to reintroduce a character, do it right. But I ask a more fundamental question. Why are you bringing this back? What does it have to do with the message here? To me, it conflicts with the innovation of this test device. An ancient character and a new piece of innovation, they do not mix.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I mean, but I tend to be more forgiving about going back to things that worked back in the day. We've talked about Burger King, bringing back the king, bringing back the old logo, and so forth. Those are things that people kind of have ingrained in their memory, particularly older affluent consumers who buy a lot of takeout food. I just think, to your point, there could have been a much more creative expression to bring back the Noid than kind of throwing them in here as a variable in a commercial that, like I said, doesn't really have a reason for being to begin with.
It's hard to believe that Crispin Porter Bogusky would say, hey, let's bring back a character that preceded us. Why would a brilliant creative shop like Crispin Porter Bogusky endorse a character they didn't invent? That I don't get.
Well, I again, I'm not to get too deep into it. I think one of the big problems with agencies generally is the opposite, right? They're afraid to use the codes and the things that previous agencies made famous. It's like if you took over the business for Frosted Flakes and said, well, we got to get rid of the tiger.
Are you saying that the Noid was as famous as Tony the Tiger? I don't think.
No, it's not, but it was definitely something that was distinctive to Domino's, and it could be distinctive again, given the proper. By the way, my understanding is funny that when Crispin had the Burger King account, the creepy king character that has been used by Burger King in the last 10 years or so was invented by Crispin.
Yes.
And it's their intellectual property that they lease to Burger King. So any subsequent agency that wants to use it ends up having to pay a royalty to Crispin Porter and Bogusky. That's my understanding of that.
Well, good for them. They were smart to do that. I'm saying I'm not saying that every agency should reinvent the wheel. We've talked about this before, that unlike Nike, which has had the same positioning, the same brand promise, and the same logo and tagline for what? As long as the Noid has been around.
Longer.
They have not changed. Yeah, longer. But now we're talking about reintroducing a character that was done inelegantly at the very, that's being generous, right? And that they didn't invent with a, I don't know what the justification for it is. It just seems to come out of nowhere. Yep. So reinventing or bringing back, reintroducing a character that might have had equity makes sense. But here it doesn't seem to work.
I think this was a series of unfortunate decisions that were made that led to this.
I agree. He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.